John Kennedy destroys woke host. Lapiv, his response surprised everyone. The studio buzzed with a carefully orchestrated energy, a hum of anticipation that crackled like static electricity. The Melissa Carter Show, a juggernaut in the world of daytime television, was known for its slick production, razor-sharp interviews, and a host who could make even the most seasoned public figures squirm. Melissa Carter herself stood backstage, her perfectly tailored blazer catching the light as she flipped through a stack of cue cards, each one meticulously crafted to serve a singular purpose: to dismantle the guest sitting across from her in just a few minutes. The guest in question, John Kennedy, the veteran senator from Louisiana, a man whose folksy charm and quick wit had made him a fixture in American politics. But to Melissa and her team, he was something else entirely, a relic, a symbol of an outdated system ripe for takedown. The plan was simple: paint Kennedy as a dinosaur, a man whose traditional values and political stances were out of touch with a rapidly changing world. If executed correctly, the interview would be a viral sensation, a clip that would dominate social media and cement Melissa's reputation as the host who could topple giants. The audience had been carefully curated. Some were genuine fans of Kennedy, their faces beaming with admiration, while others were strategically planted skeptics ready to turn on him at the right moment. Behind the cameras, producers huddled around monitors, whispering final adjustments to camera angles and lighting. Everything was designed to build a narrative one where Kennedy would falter and Melissa would emerge triumphant. In her dressing room, Melissa leaned against a vanity, her reflection staring back with a confident smirk. Her producer Jake stood nearby, scribbling on a whiteboard that outlined the perfect trap. "He's an easy target," Jake said, his voice dripping with certainty. John Kennedy: "Come on. People love his whole Southern charm thing, but that's exactly why this'll work. He's too comfortable, too predictable." Melissa nodded, her eyes gleaming. "Exactly. The world sees him as this untouchable grandfatherly figure, but we're going to show them he's stuck in the past. A politician who doesn't get it." She tossed a cue card onto the table, its edges worn from her restless fingers. "We'll hit him with questions about progress, about how his views don't align with the future. If he doubles down, we've got our clip. If he stumbles, even better." Jake grinned, circling a key phrase on the whiteboard: outdated values. "And the audience?" he asked. Melissa's smile widened. "Half of them are ready to clap like trained seals, and the other half, they're primed to call him out. We've got this." The stage was set. The trap was ready. And Melissa was certain she was about to create the viral moment of the year. Meanwhile, across town, John Kennedy sat in the back of a black SUV, the city's skyline blurring past as he headed toward the studio. His phone buzzed with notifications, staff briefings, constituent emails, the usual flurry of a senator's life. But his eyes were fixed on a single message. It had arrived in his inbox a week earlier, its subject line bold and inviting. "Exclusive invitation, a candid conversation on the Melissa Carter Show." Kennedy wasn't naive. He'd seen Melissa's show before, watched her dissect guests with the precision of a surgeon. Her reputation for sharp, strategic questioning was no secret, especially when it came to figures like him, people who represented a certain kind of traditional American ethos. He took a slow breath, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. His aide sitting across from him glanced up from her tablet. "You sure about this, Senator?" Melissa's not exactly known for playing nice. Kennedy's lips curved into a faint smile, his Louisiana drawl soft but deliberate. "I reckon I can handle a little conversation." The aide raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Kennedy's calm was unshakable, a trait that had carried him through decades of political battles. He knew what this was, an ambush dressed up as an interview. And yet, he'd accepted the invitation not out of arrogance, but because he believed in facing challenges head-on. As the SUV pulled up to the studio, a small crowd of onlookers gathered near the entrance, some holding signs of support, others just curious. A security guard, his face lighting up at the sight of Kennedy, stepped forward. "Big fan, Senator. Love what you do for Louisiana." Kennedy nodded, his smile warm but reserved. "Appreciate that, friend." The guard beamed, stepping aside as Kennedy made his way inside. The studio's interior was a whirlwind of activity. Crew members darted between sets, adjusting lights and microphones, while producers whispered into headsets. Kennedy's presence didn't go unnoticed. A few staffers exchanged glances, some excited, others skeptical. "That's him," one whispered. "Think he knows what he's walking into?" Another shook her head. "No way, Melissa's gonna eat him alive." But Kennedy, unfazed, followed a production assistant through the maze of corridors to a green room where he sat quietly sipping a glass of water. His suit was understated. His posture relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. He could sense the undercurrent of tension, the way the crew moved with purpose, the way the air felt charged with expectation. Backstage, Melissa was in her element, reviewing her cue cards one last time. Each question was a carefully crafted arrow, designed to pierce Kennedy's armor. She'd start soft, lull him into a sense of security, then strike with questions that would force him to defend his record, his beliefs, his very presence in modern politics. "We need to make him look rigid," she told Jake, her voice low but intense. "He's got this whole man-of-the-people shtick, but we'll show the audience he's out of step with where the country's headed." Jake nodded, pointing to a monitor showing the audience being seated. "We've got the perfect mix out there. Some will cheer for him at first, but the others, they're ready to pounce when you give the signal." Melissa's eyes narrowed, a predator sizing up her prey. "Good. Let's make sure the cameras catch every reaction. We want the world to see him crack." The studio lights dimmed, signaling the start of the show. The audience settled into their seats, a mix of excitement and unease, rippling through the crowd. Some clutched signs with Kennedy's name, others sat with crossed arms, their expressions guarded. The cameras rolled, capturing every angle. Melissa's polished smile, the sleek set design, the anticipation hanging in the air. Kennedy stepped out from behind the curtain, his stride steady, his face betraying nothing. A few audience members clapped enthusiastically while others watched him with skeptical eyes. He took his seat across from Melissa, his hands resting calmly in his lap. Melissa greeted him with a flawless smile, her voice warm and inviting, almost too perfect. "Senator John Kennedy, welcome to the show." The red light on the camera blinked and the audience applauded. Though the sound was uneven, a mix of genuine enthusiasm and cautious restraint. Melissa leaned forward slightly, her tone smooth as silk. "We're so thrilled to have you here. Let's start with an easy one. What do you think about the future of American politics?" Kennedy's eyes met hers, a faint glint of amusement flickering in them. He knew the game had begun. Melissa's smile was a mask, her question a carefully laid trap. The audience leaned in, some eager to hear his response, others waiting for him to stumble. The producers watched from the control room, their fingers hovering over buttons, ready to capture the moment Kennedy faltered. But what no one in the room knew, not Melissa, not her team, not the carefully selected audience, was that John Kennedy had already seen through the setup. His calm demeanor, his easy smile, his unhurried way of speaking, it wasn't naivety. It was preparation. He'd faced tougher rooms than this, from contentious town halls to heated Senate hearings. And as Melissa leaned in, expecting to steer the conversation, Kennedy sat back, his expression unreadable. "Well, Melissa," he began, his drawl slow and deliberate, "I think the future's about people coming together, not tearing each other apart." The words were simple, almost folksy, but they carried a weight that made the room pause. Melissa's smile twitched just for a moment as she realized this wasn't going to be as easy as she'd planned. The producers exchanged glances, their confidence wavering. The audience shifted in their seats, some nodding in agreement, others still waiting for the confrontation Melissa had promised. She flipped to the next cue card, her voice sharpening just enough to signal the shift. "That's a great sentiment, Senator, but let's be honest. Politics today is changing. The old ways, the traditional approaches, they're being questioned. Some say they're holding us back. Do you think your style of leadership still has a place in this new era?" It was the first real jab, subtle but pointed, designed to make Kennedy defensive, to paint him as a man out of touch. The audience stilled, sensing the tension. A few of the planted skeptics leaned forward, ready to amplify any misstep. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, as if genuinely considering her words, then smiled. "Melissa, I believe leadership isn't about chasing what's new, it's about doing what's right. Folks don't want leaders who follow trends. They want leaders who listen." The room was quiet for a split second, the weight of his words sinking in. Melissa's smile tightened, her fingers gripping the cue cards a little harder. She hadn't expected him to pivot so smoothly, to turn her question into a statement of principle. The producers scribbled notes, their whispers growing more urgent. "He's redirecting her," one muttered. "We need to push harder." Melissa sensed it too. She needed to regain control, to steer the conversation back to her narrative. "That's a lovely way to put it," she said, her tone still warm, but with an edge. "But let's talk about some of your positions. You've been vocal about certain traditional values, and some critics argue those values don't resonate with younger voters, with the direction the country's headed. Don't you think clinging to the past could alienate the next generation?" It was a bolder move, a question meant to corner him, to force him to either defend himself or backpedal. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement with Melissa, others watching Kennedy closely. The cameras zoomed in, ready to capture his reaction. But Kennedy just chuckled, a soft, disarming sound that seemed to diffuse the tension. "Melissa, I don't think it's about clinging to anything. It's about respecting what works hard, work honesty, looking out for your neighbor. You tell me, does that sound like the past, or does that sound like what folks still want today?" The question hung in the air, not accusatory, but pointed, turning the spotlight back on her. The audience stirred, a few clapping softly, others exchanging glances. Melissa's smile faltered just for a moment before she recovered. She hadn't expected him to flip the question so effortlessly, to challenge her premise without raising his voice. She glanced at her producers, who were signaling for her to move to the next question, to escalate. But Kennedy wasn't done. He leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm, his eyes steady. "See, I think folks are tired of being told what they should believe. They want someone who'll sit down, listen, and talk straight. That's what I try to do, and I reckon that's not going out of style anytime soon." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap, simple but resonant. The audience's reaction was immediate, more applause, louder this time, from even those who'd been skeptical at the start. Melissa's jaw tightened, her plan unraveling with every word Kennedy spoke. She needed to pivot, and fast, because John Kennedy wasn't just surviving her ambush, he was starting to turn the tables, and the show hadn't even hit its first commercial break. The studio lights seemed to burn a little brighter as Melissa Carter leaned forward, her smile still polished, but now laced with a subtle edge. The first round hadn't gone as planned. John Kennedy, the senator from Louisiana, sat across from her, his demeanor as calm as a summer afternoon, his faint smile disarming in a way that made her producers shift uncomfortably in the control room. Melissa had expected him to stumble to get defensive under her carefully crafted questions, but instead, he'd deflected her opening salvo with a folksy charm that had the audience murmuring in approval. She couldn't let him keep the upper hand. Flipping to the next cue card, she adjusted her posture, her voice taking on a sharper tone, still cloaked in the veneer of friendliness. "Senator Kennedy, you talk about listening and respecting what works. And that's admirable," she said, her eyes locked on his. "But let's get real for a moment. Your political career has been built on a certain kind of traditionalism. Some might even call it conservatism, that's out of step with today's progressive ideals. Don't you think that kind of thinking risks alienating a generation that's demanding change?" The question was a dagger designed to paint him as a relic, clinging to outdated ideals. And the audience stirred, some nodding in agreement, others waiting for his response with bated breath. The cameras zoomed in, ready to capture the moment he faltered. Kennedy tilted his head slightly, his eyes twinkling with a hint of amusement, as if he'd been waiting for this. He leaned back in his chair, his hands folded casually in his lap, and let the silence stretch just long enough to make Melissa blink. "Well, Melissa," he began, his Louisiana drawl slow and deliberate, "I think folks want change that makes sense, not change just for the sake of change. You don't fix a good engine by throwing out the parts that work." The audience chuckled softly, a few clapping in agreement. Melissa's smile tightened her fingers, gripping the cue cards a little harder. Kennedy wasn't taking the bait. He wasn't getting defensive or rattled. Instead, he was steering the conversation, and she could feel it slipping away. She pressed on her tone, growing more pointed. "But Senator, your voting record on issues like social reform, environmental policies, some say it shows a resistance to progress. How do you respond to critics who say you're holding back the future?" It was a direct hit meant to force him to justify his positions or risk looking stubborn. The planted skeptics in the audience leaned forward, ready to amplify her narrative. Kennedy didn't flinch. He chuckled again, a warm, disarming sound that seemed to fill the room. "Melissa, I've been around long enough to know that progress is a word folks like to throw around when they want to sound right without doing the math." The audience laughed louder this time, and even some of the skeptics cracked smiles. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but not aggressive. "I vote the way I do because I listen to the folks back home. They're not sitting around waiting for the next big idea from Washington. They're working, raising families, trying to make ends meet. They want leaders who'll stand up for what keeps their communities strong, not chase after every new buzzword." The room erupted in applause, not just from his supporters, but from others who'd been unsure at the start. Melissa's eyes darted to the control room, where her producers were whispering frantically, their monitors flashing with audience reactions. This wasn't the soundbite they'd planned for. She needed to regain control. Flipping to a new cue card, she shifted tactics, her voice taking on a patronizing sweetness. "That's a great way to connect with your base, Senator. But let's talk about the bigger picture. The country's changing demographics, values, priorities. Younger voters especially are pushing for leaders who embrace bold, forward-thinking policies. Don't you think sticking to traditional values risks making you irrelevant to the next generation?" It was a bold move, a question meant to corner him into admitting he was out of touch. The audience stilled, sensing the escalation. A few of the planted skeptics nodded, their expressions smug, but Kennedy just smiled, his eyes never leaving hers. Irrelevant, he repeated as if savoring the word. Melissa, I don't think it's about being relevant, it's about being real. Folks don't want leaders who change with the wind. They want someone who'll tell them the truth, even when it's not trendy. He paused, letting the words sink in, then added, and if standing up for what's right makes me irrelevant, well, I reckon I'll take that risk. The audience roared with applause, the sound catching Melissa off guard. She forced a laugh, but it was thin, almost brittle. That's a bold stance, Senator, she said, trying to recover. But let's dig deeper. Some of your critics argue that your approach, your focus on traditional values, can come across as divisive, especially in a time when unity is so important. How do you respond to that? It was her sharpest question yet, a veiled accusation that his principles were fracturing the country. The producers leaned closer to their monitors, sensing the moment they'd been waiting for. If Kennedy got defensive now, they'd have their viral clip. But instead, he did something unexpected. He laughed a genuine, hearty sound that seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. Divisive, he said, shaking his head. Melissa, I think folks are divided when we stop listening to each other. I was raised to believe that you don't build bridges by tearing down the other side. You build them by sitting down, talking, and finding what you've got in common. He paused, his gaze sweeping the audience. That's not divisive. That's just being human. The room exploded with applause louder than before, and even some of the skeptics clapped, their resolve wavering. Melissa's smile faltered, her confidence cracking. She glanced at her cue cards, then at her producers, who were signaling for her to pivot. She needed to hit harder to find a chink in his armor. That's a beautiful sentiment, Senator, she said, her voice now tinged with impatience. But let's talk about action. Your critics say your policies don't reflect the kind of unity you're talking about. They say you're stuck in a mindset that doesn't address the challenges of today's world. How do you justify that? It was her last card, a question meant to paint him as out of touch and force him to stumble. The audience leaned in the air, thick with anticipation. Kennedy sat back, his expression unreadable for a moment, then smiled again, that same easy, unshakable smile. Melissa, I don't justify anything, he said, his voice calm but firm. I do what I believe is right for the folks I serve. And if that means I don't fit into someone's idea of what's modern, well, I'm okay with that. Because at the end of the day, it's not about winning arguments, it's about doing right by people. The audience erupted again, the applause thunderous now. Melissa's face froze, her smile a mask that barely hid her frustration. The producers were in a panic, their whispers turning to shouts in the control room. He's turning it on, her one hissed. We need to cut to commercial. But it was too late. Kennedy had flipped the script not with anger or defensiveness, but with a quiet, unyielding strength that had the audience eating out of his hand. Melissa forced another smile, her voice strained. Well, Senator, you certainly have a way with words. Let's take a quick break, folks. But we'll be right back. As the cameras cut to commercial, the audience kept clapping, some standing, now their faces alight with admiration. Melissa's team scrambled, trying to figure out how to salvage the narrative, but Kennedy just sat there, calm as ever, his eyes scanning the room. He knew the trap, and he'd just turned it upside down. The real showdown was yet to come, and Melissa was about to learn that underestimating John Kennedy was a mistake she'd regret. The studio lights faded as the Melissa Carter Show cut to commercial, but the energy in the room lingered like the aftershock of an earthquake. The audience, still buzzing from John Kennedy's deft handling of Melissa Carter's pointed questions, whispered among themselves, some exchanging wide-eyed glances, others already pulling out their phones to post about the exchange. The senator from Louisiana sat calmly in his chair, his hands folded, his expression as serene as if he'd just finished a friendly chat over coffee. Melissa, on the other hand, is visibly rattled. Her polished smile strained as she sipped water and glanced at her cue cards. Her producers huddled in the control room were in a frenzy. "This isn't working." One snapped, slamming a clipboard onto the table. "He's making her look like the bad guy." Another producer, eyes glued to a monitor showing live social media feeds, groaned. People are already tweeting clips. "Look at this. Kennedy. Shines is trending." The plan had been to paint Kennedy as a relic, a politician out of touch with the modern world. But instead, he'd turned the tables, and the internet was starting to notice. Melissa's assistant rushed to her side during the break, whispering urgently, "We need to pivot, Melissa. He's winning them over." Melissa nodded, her jaw tight, but inside her confidence was crumbling. She'd underestimated Kennedy, and now she was paying the price. As the commercial break ended, the cameras rolled again and Melissa forced a bright smile, her voice regaining its practiced charm. "Welcome back, folks. We're here with Senator John Kennedy, and it's been quite a conversation so far." The audience clapped, but the applause was uneven, stronger from those who'd been won over by Kennedy's calm demeanor, more reserved from the skeptics who still clung to Melissa's narrative. She leaned forward, determined to regain control. "Senator, before the break, you spoke about listening and doing what's right. But let's talk about perception. Some argue that your approach, your focus on traditional values, can feel exclusionary to those who don't share your worldview. How do you respond to that?" It was a calculated move, a question designed to frame Kennedy as divisive, to force him to defend himself against an accusation of intolerance. The producers leaned closer to their monitors, hoping this would be the moment he slipped. The audience stilled, waiting for his response. Kennedy tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing her words. Then, with a slow, deliberate smile, he spoke his Louisiana drawl, as steady as ever. "Melissa, I think folks get tired of being told they're wrong for believing what they believe. I don't exclude anybody I listen to 'em. I talk to 'em. I might not agree with everybody, but that don't mean I shut 'em out." He paused, his gaze sweeping the audience. "See the way I was raised. You don't build walls by disagreeing. You build understanding by talking it out." The audience erupted in applause louder than before, and even some of the planted skeptics hesitated, their expressions softening. Melissa's smile flickered, her fingers tightening around her cue cards. She hadn't expected him to sidestep the accusation so effortlessly, turning it into a call for unity that resonated with the room. The producers exchanged panicked glances. "He's doing it again," one muttered. "He's flipping the narrative." Melissa pressed on, her voice now tinged with a hint of desperation. "That's a great sentiment, Senator, but let's be honest. Politics today is about action, not just words. Some of your critics say your actions, your votes don't always align with the kind of inclusivity you're talking about. How do you square that?" It was her last-ditch effort to pin him down, to make him look hypocritical. The audience leaned in, some nodding in agreement with her, others watching Kennedy closely. But he just chuckled, that same warm, disarming sound that seemed to cut through the tension. "Melissa, I don't square anything," he said, his tone light but firm. "I vote my conscience based on what I hear from the folks back home. They're the ones who matter, not the folks trying to score points on TV." The audience roared, the applause drowning out the last of Melissa's words. A few people stood clapping enthusiastically, while others pulled out their phones, recording the moment. Melissa's face froze, her smile a brittle mask. She glanced at the control room where her producers were scrambling their plan, unraveling in real time. As the show wrapped, the damage was already done. By the time the cameras stopped rolling, clips of Kennedy's responses were circulating online, shared by audience members who'd been live tweeting the exchange. On Twitter, hashtags like #KennedyShines and #RespectMatters began trending, accompanied by snippets of his calm, pointed retorts. "This man just schooled her without raising his voice," one user wrote, attaching a clip of Kennedy saying, "You don't build walls by disagreeing, you build understanding by talking it out." Another tweeted, "Melissa Carter thought she could trap him, but Kennedy's out here dropping truth bombs." TikTok exploded with videos of users reenacting the moment, mimicking Kennedy's drawl and Melissa's faltering smile. Instagram stories were flooded with screenshots of the senator's unruffled demeanor, captioned with phrases like "class act" and "this is how you handle an ambush." The producers still in the control room watched in horror as their carefully crafted narrative collapsed. "We need to edit this before it airs," one shouted, but it was too late. Social media had already taken over. Melissa, sensing the tide turning, decided to fight back. After the show, she recorded a quick response video, posting it to her social media accounts. "I have nothing but respect for Senator Kennedy," she said, her smile tight. "But let's be clear. This was a tough conversation, and I was just asking the questions people want answered. If folks can't handle a little debate, maybe that's the real issue." She hit upload, hoping to reclaim the narrative, but the response was brutal. Comments flooded in, accusing her of trying to spin her defeat. "You tried to bait him and he made you look foolish," one user wrote. "Kennedy didn't just answer your questions, he exposed your agenda." Another added, "The backlash wasn't just online." By the next morning, 2 major sponsors had contacted the network, expressing concerns about the show's direction. Melissa's assistant burst into her office, her face pale. "Melissa, we've got a problem. The network's getting calls and the sponsors, they're not happy." Melissa clenched her jaw, staring at her phone where notifications piled up, each one a reminder of the storm she'd unleashed. Meanwhile, Kennedy left the studio without a word, his demeanor as calm as when he'd arrived. He climbed into his SUV, ignoring the small crowd of reporters waiting outside. One managed to catch him holding up a microphone. "Any comment on the interview with Melissa Carter?" Kennedy paused, his smile faint but genuine. "I think folks just want us to listen more and shout less," he said, then slid into the car. The clip, barely 10 seconds long, went viral within hours, racking up millions of views. The internet had found its hero, and it wasn't Melissa Carter. Her show, once a powerhouse, was now teetering on the edge of a crisis. The producers scrambled to salvage the situation, but the damage was done. Melissa had wanted a viral moment, and she'd gotten one, just not the one she'd planned. And as the world kept sharing Kennedy's words, one thing was clear. The senator from Louisiana had walked into her trap and walked out unscathed, leaving Melissa to face the consequences of her own ambition. The Melissa Carter Show studio, once a beacon of daytime television, now felt like a sinking ship. The viral storm, unleashed by John Kennedy's masterful performance during the interview, had left Melissa and her team scrambling to salvage what was left of their reputation. Social media platforms buzzed incessantly, with clips of the senator's calm, incisive responses shared millions of times across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Hashtags like #ListenMore and #KennedyShines trended globally, accompanied by memes that juxtaposed Kennedy's unruffled demeanor with Melissa's increasingly strained smile. One particularly viral video looped Kennedy's line, "You don't build walls by disagreeing. You build understanding by talking it out," over a montage of people resolving conflicts with kindness, captioned, "This is how you win without fighting." News outlets, ran with the story, analyzing every moment of the exchange with headlines like Senator Kennedy, school's host in civility, and Melissa Carter's ambush backfires spectacularly. The public had chosen a side, and it wasn't Melissa's. In her office, the air was thick with tension. Her assistant stood nervously by the door, clutching a tablet that displayed a barrage of notifications, sponsor withdrawals, network demands, and a flood of critical comments online. "Melissa," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "the network's calling an emergency meeting. They're talking about the show's future." Melissa's face was a mask of forced composure, but her hands betrayed her trembling slightly as she set down her coffee mug. She'd built her career on bold, confrontational interviews, but this time she'd misjudged her opponent, and the consequences were mounting. Melissa's attempt to regain control had been a desperate video posted to her social media accounts where she tried to reframe the narrative. "I have the utmost respect for Senator Kennedy," she said, her smile tight and rehearsed. "My role is to ask tough questions to spark real conversations. If that's misunderstood, I regret it." But the apology, if it could even be called that, landed like a lead balloon. Social media users tore into it, calling it disingenuous. "She's not sorry, she's just mad." She lost. One commenter wrote, "Kennedy didn't just answer her questions, he exposed her game." Another added, "The backlash was relentless." By the next morning, 3 major sponsors had pulled their funding citing brand misalignment, and the network was fielding calls from advertisers demanding explanations. Melissa's inbox overflowed with messages, including a chilling email from the network urgent meeting to discuss the program's direction. Be prepared. She knew what it meant. Her show, her legacy, was hanging by a thread. She'd wanted to create a viral moment, to cement her reputation as a fearless host who could take down anyone. Instead, she'd handed John Kennedy a platform to shine, and the world was eating it up. While Melissa grappled with the fallout, Kennedy carried on with his life, as if the interview had been just another day at the office. He returned to Louisiana, meeting with constituents, attending community events, and working through Senate business with the same steady demeanor that had defined his career. He didn't engage with the online frenzy, didn't issue press releases, or bask in the spotlight. His silence was deafening, and it only amplified his impact. The public saw it as a mark of humility, a refusal to play the media's game, and it made them love him more. Reporters swarmed him, eager for a soundbite to keep the story alive. One caught him outside a local diner, a paper cup of coffee in his hand, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder. "Senator Kennedy, any comment on the Melissa Carter interview?" the reporter asked, microphone extended. Kennedy paused, his eyes crinkling with a faint, knowing smile. "Folks just want us to listen more and argue less," he said, his drawl soft but deliberate. He tipped his head politely and walked away, leaving the reporter stunned. The clip, barely a sentence long, exploded online, garnering millions of views in hours. "This man is unstoppable," one user tweeted. "He doesn't need to fight, he just speaks the truth." Another wrote, "The hashtag #ListenMore surged, becoming a rallying cry for those tired of divisive rhetoric." The cultural ripple effect was profound. Kennedy's words had sparked a movement not just about politics, but about how people communicate. Blogs and opinion pieces praised his approach with titles like "The Quiet Power of John Kennedy" and "Why Civility Wins." Teachers began using clips of the interview in classrooms, sparking discussions about respect and dialogue. One educator shared a post online. "Showed my students the Kennedy interview today. We talked about how to stand firm without tearing others down. That's a lesson they'll carry forever." Community leaders cited his example in town halls, encouraging people to approach disagreements with understanding rather than anger. The public was hungry for this message, tired of media spectacles designed to inflame. They found in Kennedy a model of strength through restraint. His words, "You don't build walls by disagreeing, you build understanding by talking it out," became a mantra printed on T-shirts, shared in motivational posts, and even quoted in church sermons. It wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about showing that real strength lies in staying true to one's values, even under pressure. For Melissa, the consequences were dire. The network meeting was a bloodbath. Executives grilled her on the show's plummeting ratings, the loss of sponsors, and the public's perception of her as manipulative. "You underestimated him," one said sharply. "You thought you could outmaneuver a man like Kennedy, and now we're cleaning up the mess." Melissa tried to argue her case, insisting she was just doing her job, but the room was cold. The decision was made: the Melissa Carter Show would be overhauled. Its format softened to avoid further controversy, but the damage was done. Viewership continued to decline, and within weeks the network quietly announced the show's cancellation, replacing it with a safer, less confrontational program. Melissa tried to pivot, appearing as a guest on other shows and pitching new projects, but her brand was tainted. Social media was unforgiving, with users mocking her failed ambush. She thought she could trap Kennedy, but he trapped her with kindness. One meme read, pairing a screenshot of her faltering smile with Kennedy's calm gaze. Melissa read the comments in silence, her ambition now a fading echo. She'd wanted to redefine the narrative, but instead she'd become a cautionary tale. The lesson of the story was clear, and it resonated far beyond the studio. John Kennedy hadn't triumphed by outshouting Melissa or matching her aggression. He'd won by listening, by responding with clarity and respect, by refusing to be drawn into a fight. His approach was a powerful reminder that true strength doesn't need to be loud. It's found in authenticity, in staying grounded in one's principles. The public embraced this message, sharing stories of how they'd applied it in their own lives, resolving family disputes, navigating workplace conflicts, or simply having better conversations with friends. Kennedy's example showed that communication doesn't have to be a battle. By listening more than we speak, by approaching others with respect, we can build understanding even in the most tense situations. His words became a call to action, encouraging people to choose dialogue over division, to value connection over confrontation. For students, professionals, and everyday people, it was a lesson in how to stand firm without tearing others down, a lesson that would outlast the headlines and shape how people approached disagreements for years to come. In the end, the story wasn't just about a failed interview or a viral moment. It was about the enduring power of quiet strength. Melissa Carter had tried to bury John Kennedy, but in doing so, she'd buried herself. Her career built on provocation crumbled under the weight of her own tactics. Kennedy, meanwhile, carried on untouched by the storm he'd weathered. He didn't need to claim victory. His actions spoke louder than any press release could. And as the world continued to share his words, one thing was certain: the lesson of listening, of standing firm with grace, was a gift to us all. It reminded us that in a world often defined by noise and division, the most powerful voice is often the one that speaks with respect, clarity, and heart.